Okay. Okay, welcome committee members, liaisons, and members of the public to the Legal Services Trust Fund Commission Executive Committee meeting. We are using Zoom with the goal to foster a more inclusive environment and effective meeting. If you would like to comment during the meeting, please type "I have a comment" or "I have a question" in the chat, and a message will be sent to the host. Alternatively, you can also use the raise hand feature. In efforts of transparency for all those joining this public meeting, whether by phone or Zoom, we request that you refrain from having side conversations on chat about the content of the meeting. Again, the chat feature is utilized simply as a tool for you to virtually indicate that you would like to speak in order to help the chair facilitate the discussion. A reminder that all Legal Services Trust Fund Commission and committee meetings are recorded and posted to the State Bar website. And lastly, a friendly reminder that this is a video conference and to please be aware of your surroundings. If you are using your phone to dial into this meeting, please be sure your computer's microphone is on mute to avoid audio feedback issues. And while joining audio via computer is highly recommended, if an individual loses audio, they can call in separately using the Zoom conference number.
Great, I'll do a quick roll call. Bonachet?
Here.
Eric?
Here.
Kim?
Here.
Rich?
Here.
Okay, we have quorum. Let me do staff and liaisons. Selena Copeland? Bonnie Huff? Christine Gonan? Mark Tony? Chris, you're on. Vicky, you're on. Brady, is Brady on?
No, not yet.
Okay, not yet. Are there any members of the public who would like to introduce yourself? Is there anybody? Are there public members, Vicky?
There is, if they'd like to just announce themselves, if they could use the raise hand feature or just put in the chat and then we'll unmute you.
Oh,
Okay.
Lauren's on. Can you unmute her to see if
Yes.
she's on behalf of Selena, then we can promote her.
Of course.
Lauren, can you hear us? Okay, great. Are there any other? So Lauren's participating. Lauren, are you participating on behalf of Black?
Yep, Selena
Okay.
can make it today.
Great. Are there any other members of the public who would like to introduce yourself or would like to make a public comment at this time? I don't see anybody else, right, Vicky? That's
Right.
raising their hand. Okay, so Bonachet, we could turn it back over to you for the
Okay,
next
great.
item.
Let's just go to the third agenda item for a motion for the approval of the meeting summary and action items from February 12th, 2021.
Do we have someone that will move?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, so Rich moves and Eric seconds. I'll do a quick roll call. Bonachet?
Yes, though I was absent, but I did review it and yes.
Okay, and you can vote it even if you were absent is what
That's
Brady
right.
advised us. Eric?
Yes.
Kim?
Yes.
Rich?
Yes.
Motion passes.
Okay, great. Let's move on to agenda item number 4 for discussion and approval of the 2021-2022 provisionally licensed lawyer grants. I will turn that over to you.
Okay,
Come on.
great. And Chris has a PowerPoint presentation to provide you with kind of the staff review process and the staff recommendation.
Okay, great.
All right, can you see the slides?
Yes. Yes, thank you.
And please feel free to jump in as Chris is presenting. We have a small group, and so if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt us.
Yes, please. Yeah, there's like a slide at the end that invites discussion, but the presentation is long enough that it would be most helpful to ask your question right away as soon as it pops into your head. All right. So the staff's presentation will refresh the committee's memories and inform any public members about the authorizing statute for the PLL grants and what the committee and board of trustees' selection criteria were and how the scoring rubric is designed. And then staff are going to present its process for reviewing all the PLL grant applications, its scores, for those applications, its recommendation for award recipients and funding levels, and then staff have 2 proposed resolutions for the committee's consideration if it agrees with the recommendations in staff's memo. So just as a quick overview, this is the subsequent slides dive into each of these a little bit, but to sort of preview it for you, the State Bar received 32 applications for provisionally licensed lawyer, or PLL, grant funding. The total requests of all applications was $2,381,000. Total funding available is projected to be $1,360,000, and I have a slide that explains the staff's projection for total funding and why it's only a projection and not confirmed yet. Staff recommend in its materials and later in this presentation 20 awards out of the 32 applications for a total of $1,359,000. The number just above that, the $1,360,000, is rounding up a little bit. So staff's recommendation is a rounded down figure just to be safe. $1,359,000. 3 of the PLLs, 3 of those 20 would work at organizations that serve every county in the state, and the PLL's focus, that its work would be directed at every county. 17 of them would serve 1 or more counties, but wouldn't be statewide. Together, they would reach 43 counties in California. At least 30 of those are rural or counties that have relatively few civil legal aid providers. And 15 of the 20 PLLs would be working on COVID-19 natural disaster or rural legal aid. And as the scoring rubric slide describes, those were the special consideration categories for funding. The average award is about $68,000, and the average award is for 12 to 13 months.
Hey, Chris,
That's for 20 total PLLs, right?
That's for 20 total PLLs, correct?
yeah. Also, Chris, when you say the average award is 68,000, so you're assuming a certain projection for next fiscal year, right? In all that.
That's correct.
So
Yeah.
it turns out, so like half of that 68,000 essentially is based upon a projection for next year, so essentially. So if you end up, if that projection comes in lower, those awards, I guess, are all subject to reduction or higher if it comes in more, right? Maybe, yes?
That is a perfectly correct description of the caveat around this average funding amount. So another slide kind of details that, but basically the total funding for PLL grants comes from 2021 and 2022 donations that are collected through the State Bar fee bill for attorneys. So we know how much the State Bar collected in 2021, and we're projecting for 2022. So to the extent that staff's projection was too low, that average award will be adjusted proportionally upwards for each applicant. And if staff's projection for 2022 was too high, that award, each applicant's award, will be proportionally adjusted downwards.
And this was a little tricky because there was a specific end date for this legislation. And so we waited until next year to then distribute the other half of it. Programs wouldn't have enough time to gear up, and we wouldn't have enough time to distribute because it ends at the end of next June, right, Chris?
That's correct, yeah.
So it's a short time period. So we had to do a projection in order to maximize the funding for programs.
Let me just jump in here really quick, because I think everybody wants to, they have a lot of questions. So I know you, Duan, you said, let's just jump in as we go.
Of course.
But let me make sure everyone is actually going to be heard. I see that Kim has a comment. I have a comment. Rich, are you coming back in with a comment? Okay. And how about you, Eric?
Well, you guys can go ahead and I'll see if I still have.
So we'll just go in that order, Kim, and then myself, and then Rich. Go ahead, Kim.
Yeah, even though we're small, would it help if we use the hand feature? Do you want us to use the raise hand feature? We're small, but I can see we're all excited.
Yeah, if you do the raised hand, that would be good for me.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, perfect, thank you.
So my question is that average award, I'm curious about what you figured the salary of this position would be in relationship to a staff attorney position. Now, when I say staff attorney position, I realize we got a big range. I was pretty well paid at LAFLA, but if I were in Fresno, it wasn't be so well
Kim,
paid.
what we require in the RFP is that they have to offer the PLL a salary that was commensurate to their entry level staff attorney position. And then
Okay.
we required them to upload their salary scale. And Chris confirmed that proposal fell in their range for their particular organization. I mean, there was some contemplation. We considered, do we do like a fix across the state? But we thought letting programs decide for themselves, but as long as they're commiserate with their own, was the fairest, because we don't want to penalize a program that's paying maybe above market.
Right.
But we want them to be treated fairly and not the PL to be treated like an entry level,
Right.
commiserate to
Okay.
that-
I'd forgotten that we had already talked about this. So thank you. And then I think that also applies to their benefits also.
Yes,
So
yes, yes.
It's just as if they were an entry level
Yes.
staff attorney.
Yes, and
Okay.
that's really explicit. I mean, Chris did a really good job of like identifying that in not
Okay.
only the RFP, but when we did the webinar, to really emphasize that we don't want a different class for just the PLL. We want them to be treated equally as an entry level, whether that equal benefits, equal salary, and every other kind of a protection or
Right.
soft
Benefit. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay.
One thing I'd add to that is something about this average number that makes it look lower. It makes it look like staff were stingy or something than they really were. Is a few of the applicants put in their budget that they would use some other funding source to supplement the PLL salary and compensation. So the PLL grant was going to pay for maybe like half of their salary for a year. And those low asks, those low budget requests kind of drag the average down a little bit. Most applicants asked for 100% of what it would cost to hire a PLL for like a year, 12 or 13 months.
Okay.
But a few of them are kind of dragging the average down.
Great.
Would you like me to move on to the next slide?
Actually, yeah, Chris, I have a question and Rich has a question on this slide still. You may, and I'll just go to my question now. You may talk about this in the slides to come, but since we're here on the applicants, are these applicants, these 32 applicants, are they already sitting in those seats at those organizations, or are some of these folks are going to be recruited in and these job postings will be out there for them? That's
The
question
latter.
number one.
The latter. It's about, I can pull up and look up the exact number, but my recollections, it's about a little over half have already selected a PLL. Either that person is already working there because they were allowed to go back to January 1st and count a hire from January 1 onwards if they wanted. So some of them, they're already doing the work. Some of them, they've selected a PLL but haven't hired them yet, but they've like interviewed folks and they actually made a selection. And then a little under half are still in the recruiting process for someone. And some of those who are still recruiting are actually waiting to find out if they're going to get an award before they like go
Hire,
all the
make
way
the
to
hire.
interviews.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And just to supplement that, Bonachet, we've been explicit in that telling applicants that if they are awarded, there's a window for them to hire, but beyond that window, we have to kind of move on to the next, because we have to be assured that, there's, it's a limited funding, limited time period. So if they can't hire an X amount, and I can't recall the date now,
July 1st,
we will
I think
move on to the next, we will then provide the funding to the next highest scoring applicant.
Got it. Okay, very good. And then the 17 PLLs that are collectively serving 43 counties, do we have a sense of the impact of that, especially in the rural areas that we're talking about? I mean, it seems like a great number, 17, but do we have a sense of the reach of that? How many constituencies, clients they're going to actually be serving?
Well, we have a sense based on like what they proposed in the application. There is an evaluation that they're required to submit at the end of the grant period, and so we'll have firm numbers then. But not all applicants provided, say, quantitative number of clients that the PLL would assist in.
Got it. Okay,
That's right.
those were my two questions. Rich, please.
If you were to underproject, if you had underprojected by $68,000, what I heard Chris say is you'd take the 68,000 surplus and divide it up amongst the applicants that were already chosen.
That's correct.
You also have a choice of adding a 21st. And I'm just curious how that decision was made.
That's a great question. So
What do you mean 21st? Sorry.
An additional program, additional award.
Oh, an additional award. Okay.
yeah, as opposed to like everyone who got a grant gets a little bit more. That's a good question. So the distribution plan that the executive committee and then later the Board of Trustees executive committee approved made the decision to do the pro rata increase or decrease for whoever got an award originally. As far as how staff arrived at that proposal back in February when we were describing the distribution plan to both of the executive committees, I think the reason was we didn't think there would be enough time to do another application review process in the spring of 2022, because we'll find out they may have submitted an application this spring in 2021, and we could go back to our list to see who didn't get funded and maybe go to the next highest scoring program. But we'd have to make sure they still qualified. You know, they'd have to still be able to hire a PLL at that late stage. And I think the idea was it would be a very short period of time between when we found out whether or not 2022 contributions were higher or lower than we expected to actually do a new application review process for someone, confirm their eligibility, get them to sign a grant agreement, and then confer the award.
Rich, it's tricky because as you all know, the fee bill isn't due until February 1st. And then what Chris and I actually learned is there are a number of attorneys that paid late. And so we couldn't get an accurate number until March. And by that time, if we were going to go back and, you know, redistribute or then do that second year of funding, we don't have time. I mean, it's already taking us now to May in order to convene with you. It just wouldn't be enough time to spend down half of the funding.
So would that be baked into the resolution that we approve, assuming we approve the group's recommendation here? Would it be baked in that this upward or downward adjustment would automatically be made?
That's a great question. It's in the distribution plan, Dwan, that the Board of Trustees Executive Committee passed by resolution that would be how an increase or decrease was handled. So I don't know if we need a new resolution, but
yes. So the two resolutions that are going to come before you at the end of the meeting doesn't have it explicitly stated like this. Chris and I haven't talked about this, but what I imagine in my head is at that point when Chris and I start getting seeing whether in next February, March of next year, whether our projection is panning out, we would call another XCOM meeting or roll it into the next XCOM meeting. Because XCOM is so small, we think we can just bring it back to you, and that can be pretty swift.
Okay.
I'm just making
Clearly, Chris, you have, and Dawn, you have our attention. We have a lot of questions for you guys.
No, it's great. Great.
That was only slide number one. How many more do you have?
Oh, there's many, but we've got a generous time container. We definitely will probably be ending early, even if you have lots of questions. So, okay. So this is just a quick reminder for the public members. The authorizing statute is Business and Professions Code 6140.03. These grants, it provides that these grants last, the funding lasts 2 years. It's from January 1st, 2021 through 2023. And what it does is it increases by $5 the voluntary or quote opt-out donation to legal services on attorneys as fee statements. So it's 2 years worth of donation opportunities for attorneys. It increases they'd have to decide that they didn't want to pay the $5. Otherwise, by default, they stay opted in. The $5 gets pooled to create competitive grants just for current qualified legal services projects and qualified support centers in California to hire provisionally licensed lawyers. And those are the participants of the State Bar's provisional licensure program. And then any funds that remain after that program ends, and it has a sunset date of June 1st of 2022, it's next June 1st. Any funding that remains after that date gets distributed by ILTA formula. So staff have revised the projections because at our last report to the executive committee back in mid-February, even though the attorney dues were due on February 1st, so almost everyone who was going to donated by February 1st. Some folks did pay their dues late. I think that happens every year, which means some of them also donated $5 after February 1st. So the revised projections incorporate those that kind of trickled in afterwards. So the 2021 contributions, those the total of those $5 contributions to PLL grants, this is a known number, is about $739,000. It's a little higher than that, but we round it down. $739,000. Staff project for 2022, $621,000. That's an intentionally conservative projection. It's about the same discount, so to speak, that we were using back in February. What we did to decide what a conservative reduction would be is we looked at how much these opt-out contributions decreased between 2020 and 2021. And then we just assumed that the decreased rate would be the same to be safe. There's no other reason why we
but Chris, let me just add, but the reason why it's conservative is there really isn't a reason to believe with the economy improving and the economy opening back up and things are improving, that we are going to have a reduction that's that level for another year. So that's why, but Chris and I, we veered on the conservative side because it's easier to distribute, if we had $100,000 extra than to have programs return funds. So we erred on being a bit conservative.
Yeah, that's right. And then the proportional increase or decrease that reflects actual donations that come in 2022 would be incorporated into grantees' final grant payment. And this has been communicated to them very clearly, but we'll probably need to remind them that this was in the distribution plan and the RFP and in staff's webinar to all the applicants. And I think it's also in the grant assurances. So they've probably seen it in 3 or 4 different places now, but we'll be sure that folks don't get caught off guard.
And Brady's currently drafting the grant agreement, so we'll definitely make it crystal clear. And then what we'll do is once we send out the grant agreement, Chris, maybe we should highlight in the body of the email, just so that. Because
it's not something I think that programs are particularly used to that happening. Usually the funding amount is known up front. So the grant requirements, just a quick refresher. Some of these are statutory, some of them are just the distribution plan because the legislature gave the commission and board of trustees authority to set selection criteria. It is limited to QLSPs and sports centers by statute. It is limited to quote, to hire PLLs by statute. The distribution plan provides that the program needs to hire the PLL on or after January 1st of 2021. That's when the statute became effective. The authorizing legislation became effective. And they need to hire someone by July 1st of 2021. That was a deadline that the executive committee of the commission and board set to ensure that if a program was struggling to hire someone or just dragging their feet, that staff could select another program to ensure that as many of these funds get spent down as possible before June 1st of 2022. The Commission Executive Committee interpreted the statute to allow programs to rehire an employee who had left the organization if they wanted to bring someone back to be a PLL after January 1st, and also to convert an existing employee who is not currently a PLL into a PLL after January 1st of 2021. And there were programs that asked if they could do that because they had staff who had doctorate degrees who qualified to become PLLs if they wanted to, and would do that to be able to apply for these grants. So they would basically become like program associates or program managers, and they would become provisionally licensed lawyers. So that was allowed. The grants would be for full-time staff. That's to support essentially a living wage for these provisionally licensed lawyers. The program would have to commit to providing a first-year attorney salary and benefits commensurate with what they provide to other first-year attorneys. And because the statute requires the funds only to go to hiring PLLs, that can only cover the PLL salary, payroll taxes, and benefits. Okay, the selection criteria, and this is, I'm almost done with the review piece, and then I'll talk about the selection process. But as a reminder, the core selection criteria were geared to direct funding towards those programs that were best situated to leverage their provisionally licensed lawyers' ability to practice law, to best leverage that to help people in a meaningful way, and they were best positioned to support that PLL through adequate like onboarding, training, mentorship, and supervision, and to best to protect clients and the PLL's experience during the grant period. So the questions on the application and the scoring rubric sought to identify that. So the selection criteria focused on impact, which is leveraging the provisional license on a project that's well within the organization's experience and expertise, supporting the PLL, including training, mentorship, and other professional development, safeguarding the PLL and the clients through quality assurance safeguards. And then there was a focus on recruiting a diverse and strong candidate pool to make sure that they select the best possible person.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Please, Eric, go ahead.
So I noticed that in looking at the the ultimate recommendations and looking at the scoring, that most of the differentiation between those that scored well and those that didn't was on this fourth dimension, was on recruitment, and then also on this extra points thing that I'm sure you'll talk about later. So this is maybe just, I'll put a pin on this question, but that surprised me. I thought the differentiation of just going in cold would have been more in the other dimensions than in recruitment. Recruitment seemed like kind of so they're recruiting a diverse pool of candidates. So I guess what I'm asking you is if you could later on, when you go over your list, if you could give me an example of how you differentiated on that dimension, an example of some that were strong in recruitment versus those that were not, because I'm just curious about.
No, it's a really good question. And we actually, this is, and Chris can go through this when we go through the scoring rubric. We had heavy discussion because when we went to calibrate, for instance, my score in recruitment, I approached it differently than Chris and Elizabeth. And so we had to recalibrate that scoring. So that's a really good question. But can we put a pin in it, Eric?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
That's a really good question.
While we're looking at this, let's go back to number one and my question about impact. Given that impact is here as a criteria, I'm surprised that in the application, there wasn't more quantitative discussion by the applicants as to their reach and their impact. I mean, that's where my mindset is when I think about these kinds of fundings, right? Whether
and we didn't ask them in terms of quantitative. So I think in the future, if that's of interest to the commission or the committee, then we could be more explicit. But there wasn't, in terms of how the question was drafted, some did and some didn't, because there wasn't an explicit ask for quantifiable outcomes or projection of quantifiable outcomes.
So then how did you guys, when you were looking at, and we'll discuss this when we look at the applications more, how did you as a staff address impact looking at the applications?
We took a holistic approach, substantive area, region, the strength of the project proposal, and we can give you some examples maybe when we get to the scoring rubric, but we did take a holistic approach because the projects really were diverse, and it's hard to compare one project, say, that focused on family law versus a project that focused on housing or or more impact work. The numbers itself, it would be hard to compare the two. So that's why we took a individual but holistic approach for each application.
One of the things that we also noticed as we were scoring them was that impact was probably the wrong word for this category on the scoring rubric, because with the scoring, with the distribution plan and the scoring rubric actually were asking, and with the grant application actually asked them to talk about, was kind of what's written here. How will they leverage this ability to practice law on a project that's within the organization's experience and expertise? So it's more like, how will you give this PLL the best possible, like, will they be in court? Are they just going to be giving, which would be like highly leveraging it, versus they're just going to give general legal information and not be practicing law at all? And is this something that's within the organization's experience and expertise? So it almost looked more at sort of like what type of work the person would be doing, kind of activities they would be doing, like the depth of intervention and how experienced the org was with that, with clinics versus litigation or in that area of law, more than like scale of like number of clients. So that's what the question actually asked them to talk about, and what we ended up focusing on in scoring the applications. So we noticed maybe impact wasn't the right word to summarize that that question on the application. Maybe something else like sort of like depth of intervention or something, or experience with the interventions would have been more
Chris,
specific.
Yeah, as Chris is speaking, I'm kind of thinking there's really kind of two purposes. One is to enrich the organization in the sense of strengthening their staffing and then consequently the work, but it's also making sure that this person who hopefully becomes a staff attorney in a QLSP gets a well-rounded experience, one that encourages them to want to do this kind of work.
Exactly, Kim, exactly.
You know, it's kind of like these are two important things that has to be balanced. Now, I think that's, I mean, when I hear you, Bonashif, talking about this, I'm thinking that's what I want to hear from them. I want to have them address kind of that two-pronged
Exactly.
That's exactly.
approach.
But that's why there.
That's right, Kim. That's right. And also the other part of that, I think, is because every time we're looking at grant dollars that come to us, we're hoping to position the work and position the funds in a way where we can go back, hopefully, and ask for more. And to do that, we need to show data. And so
and we'll be collecting data.
but I'm speaking specifically about reach and impact. So this, I understand number one, and I won't belabor this any longer because we'll get into the applications. But when I read number one, I also can read that there's, the existing project of that organization that this PLL will be infused within. That work is already in existence. That work is already, providing services. There's already a flow, right, in that work. And then the infusion of this PLL can then produce what additional result? Right?
Yes,
That's what I'm looking for.
Exactly.
When I'm asking for impact.
And I think based on your comment, Bonashif, that maybe in the future we might want to have it a more explicit question about quantifiable or even qualitative impact, because there were programs that added that in their response to one, and we found it helpful. But the thing is, we didn't explicitly ask for it, so I don't think we should penalize programs for not.
No, I don't think we should either. But I just think we want to start. And this also showed up in the HP grants too, right? We were looking at quantified, real data. So I think if we could start to incorporate that, but it's also good for the programs. Right, so that there really is, they're looking for measurable results, as we all are hoping for. All right.
So so the next time around on impact, we would want to maybe spell out a few, some specific kind of subtopics that they want.
We might, but we also there's some substantive areas or some types of work that doesn't it's hard to capture and quantifiable. So I wouldn't want to
appreciate that.
Discourage that. Yeah.
Maybe you guys can work with Jim Neeker and see how that can be asked. What's the teasing out those questions to be able to capture all the programs. Some can be quantifiable in real hard numbers, and some of them it might be a different another way that can.
Because with some of the impact work, as you all know, the litigation can drag on for years, and so they're not able to say that they can close a case in this time period of a PLL and serve this or have this type of impact. I mean, it's just very, very difficult. But I think with that said, some outcome indication is helpful, I think.
And
I think we have to be creative on that. We don't want to be we don't want to be like the Legal Services Corporation, which just wants to know cases open and closed. So, but I do think it's tricky.
It is,
I think it's great for staff to work with Jim on that, especially because they'll be first-year attorneys. So it takes a while to train a first-year attorney. They might not, their first-year case numbers might be lower than what you would expect a seasoned legal aid attorney to be achieving. So we can work with him to figure out what are the most meaningful metrics for a first-year attorney doing this work. Because if you just looked at case numbers, you might be like, oh, why isn't it more or something? Right. If they were, say, shadowing a supervising attorney on something for the first 4 months. I'm
sorry, I don't want to belabor it also, but I'm just thinking it'd be interesting to have these PLLs comment on their skill development also. I mean, we're talking, I think it'd be in some way to kind of capture their experience, about how many times.
That's a good idea. I
That's
wonder
okay.
if it's
Love
not
that.
too
Board
late,
and, yeah,
because we gave programs a heads up that they would have to submit outcomes measures, the same as our other grants. But I wonder if it's still possible to do like a, it's like a client satisfaction, the PLL's experience in some type of survey.
oh, I
Yeah.
think we could do that towards the end, you know?
But I think we just have to let them know and make sure that I don't know if we put in the it's a Brady question whether we can
Yeah.
still require that, even though we haven't been explicit.
It's in the RFP.
it's
It's
in
in the
RFP? Okay.
distribution. Yeah.
Okay.
We were very high level about what the evaluation would require.
Okay.
But I'm pretty sure whatever we wrote in there will capture that. But we'll
Okay.
have to check. Yeah, but I'm pretty sure it'll be able,
That's great.
because we
That's
definitely
great.
we should definitely measure that if we can.
Rich has a question.
Yeah, this brought to mind the fact that when we went out to San Bernardino and realized that the coverage of the QLSP there was so huge geographically that the addition of a PLL might enable them to open up an office in Rialto, I think was one of the areas they wanted to expand to. And it seems to me that the opportunities are so vast, it would be very difficult to compare opening up a branch office to appearing in court, and which is better for the community. How many more touches in the community have we been able to achieve? It's very subjective.
It's very subjective. I mean, that's the piece that it's why it's good that like there are multiple reviewers for each application, because it is subjective.
Yeah. And the other thought that I had was that I noticed in the evaluation section, it was aimed at the grant recipient, but the PLL should create a self-evaluation. We might provide them with a form to
Mhm.
return to us, so we have a uniform response from all 20.
No, that's a great idea.
That's great.
I like that a lot.
Yeah.
This is so helpful.
All right. Well, that's only page number 7, Chris. Let's see.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I just think by the end of the presentation, you'll like all your questions will have been answered. Well, this is just to show you what the rubric was again, so that when you later on you're evaluating what it means to look at a score of meets expectations versus exceeds. There were differences of 5 points between each category. So if they didn't address a category at all, they just got 0 points for it. I don't think we had a single person get 0 points. Yeah, 15 points was otherwise the lowest if it fell below expectations. Meets was 20, 25 was exceeds. Just to kind of, we had a review guide that actually gave definitions for these things, but to kind of summarize it for you, a meets expectations was a response that was very clear. It directly addressed the application question, and it gave enough information, enough detail that staff found it was both realistic and probative that they would actually satisfy the rubric objective for that category. And exceeds, below just means that it wasn't probative that they would be able to do this, or it wasn't realistic. And then it exceeds was that there was something that really stood out as compelling about the narrative response as compared to the other the rest of the applications. Special consideration, there was a bank of up to 10 additional points, so that the sort of without special consideration, the most a program could get was 100 points. The special consideration was up to 10 additional points for focusing on COVID-19, natural disaster, and or rural legal aid.
What is COVID-19 legal aid?
Great question. So we actually had quite a few of those. And so the two that come into mind was we had a fair number of applications that were going to have the PLL focus almost exclusively on trying to mitigate the surge in evictions after the eviction moratoria are lifted. So we gave COVID-19 points for that. And then in the application, they talked sort of about that would be the focus of the PLL, that they would be working just with those clients who had eviction stays. And then another one was a program was going to be working with veterans whose, I guess because the National Archives were closed for so long in Washington, D.C., certain veterans applications were delayed, increasing their risk of homelessness. And that, they tied it to COVID-19, but they had to explicitly do that.
Yeah, that applicant did a really good job of explaining like why for their constituency, COVID had an impact and how they would address that. But they went into details and it was really explicit. Where we had to calibrate the staff that reviewed this, and there were 3 staff that reviewed each application, is that I think we were more or less in agreement with which programs should receive these extra consideration. We were not, at least at the beginning, in agreement with what that number was. And that's where we had to recalibrate.
Okay. So you might say like, well, the first one's housing law and the second one's public benefits law, but as long as they were able to say like, we're going to be focusing on the population that was harmed during the pandemic, because that's what they needed to get the points. All right. Okay. So now that was the review. So onto the scoring process. It was due to a short timeline for a review. It was about 2.5 weeks turnaround time between when the applications came in and when this committee needed to meet to consult with staff about grantees. The commission delegated to staff the responsibility of scoring and then presenting those scores to the executive committee. 3 staff members scored all 32 applications. We didn't divide them up. We followed a review guide that was modeled on the, is very similar to like the partnership grants review guide. We tried to be consistent with how we were interpreting the same scoring rubric categories that process also used below meets and exceeds expectations. So there was some uniformity and consistency across grants. We held a calibration session. We took one application and we discussed it in depth, how the scoring rubric would apply to it so that we knew we were interpreting the rubric the same way. And then each staff member scored all 32 and then met to discuss the individual scores in each rubric category for every single one of those applications. And also arrived at unified funding recommendations.
How varied were the responses, or the reverse? How uniform were your results?
Oh, like how much did we have to like meet in the middle of where we are? So we were because it was staff and driven, and because staff also participate in like the partnership grants review and in the EAF EAF applications. I think we were really close together. Where we varied was probably in special consideration, I think, and that's where we had to do the most calibrating. I don't know if you would characterize it.
And some in impact, like Chris, if you go back to the scoring rubric, yeah, so the special consideration, like I mentioned before, I think more or less we were in agreement with when there was a project that stuck out that it has special consideration. Where I think we disagreed somewhat, or at least at the forefront. I'll just take myself. I was part of the VB team. In some instances, I might have given an 8 or a 9 because it seemed like there was far reach. They were really detailed in the response, and Chris and Elizabeth might have gone a little bit lower. So we had to kind of talk through to make sure where it was that we would land on the high end, a 9 or 10, and where it was like a 1 or 2. And that's where we kind of smoothed out the scoring to make sure we were approaching it differently. Because I think my scale was a little bit more generous than Chris and Elizabeth. So we had to be consistent. But I think we were in agreement though with which ones deserve special consideration. And I think the same with impact. Chris, do you want to talk about recruitment now? Eric's.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. And I was gonna say like safeguards, I think we were like tremendously consistent.
Yeah,
like, we all had very high expectations for like adequate attorney supervision of the, there's also a requirement of the provisional licensure program that they have an attorney supervisor that checks their work. But for recruitment, the rubric asks them and the application asks them to actually describe their steps that they will take in the future or that they took in the past to ensure a diverse and strong applicant pool. So a fair number of applicants were most brief on this particular part of the application. They just said, well, we post to these 3 websites, or we'll post to our website. We'll see what comes in, and that's it. Like versus some, and we're sure that they probably had a really thoughtful process that they just didn't take a lot of space to describe. And then other applicants actually really spelled out the steps and said, like, our review team is always a diverse hiring panel. These are all the steps in the process. We weed out implicit biases in these ways. And by posting to these websites or recruiting from these schools, we ensure that we're doing outreach to underrepresented minorities in hopes of getting a diverse candidate pool. So if they actually took the time to really describe it, they got more points for recruitment. This one was more like how much detail they're provided.
But not just how much detail. I mean, it really goes to like how much thought that they spent in terms of trying to recruit the best applicant.
Yeah, and I think we gave exceeds to a few programs that really went out of their way to describe how they would ensure diversity in the candidate pool. That were either doing a tremendous, proposed to do tremendous amount of outreach to minority bar associations and law schools that have minority majority student bodies.
Rich has his hand raised.
Sorry, Rich, please go ahead.
There was another side to recruitment which we discussed early on, which was what steps they would be taking to assure that the PLLs matriculated out of that program, passed the bar, and came back to work for them. I mean, the idea here is to invest in people for the long term, not for the 1 or 2 years you get out of them here, but to counter the trend of law students with heavy debt moving into the commercial sector instead of into this area. And I didn't see that. It's not described here. And I looked at certain of the applications that didn't seem to focus on that at all. Did you find any of that?
I think some of them were tucked in the support category. And, we have the questions that the way it's designed, that there was a question that addressed each of these categories. But I think that for what you're looking, Rich, some of it was tucked in the support question, that they did a really good job providing not just, your typical kind of onboarding training, but it was really in-depth mentorship, in-depth support, and an investment in kind of the PLL. And in those instances, they got an exceeds. When it went like above and beyond, it was a total investment in the PLL and ensuring that their experience would be positive.
And I think the application instructions for recruitment suggested to them, I think there was like in parentheses, we said, please consider describing the following. And then we gave them like basically kind of fed them what they could talk about. One of the things was how your candidate that you've selected or your process will result in a PLL that's like public interest minded or like bought into your mission. It wasn't phrased that way, but I don't think a lot of some applicants really paid attention to those like suggested categories of things to talk about, and some didn't. And so I don't think that was when a lot of them picked up on.
Yeah. I mean, as I think about that, Rich, it's a good question, but how would you really even accurately measure that? I mean, just think about your law firm. I mean, what would you say? I mean, we provide them good support. We're nice people. We take them out to dinner. I don't know, put them on good projects. How would you even measure that?
Easy to say, but not so easy to do.
True.
Yeah, we did note that one of them, I remember us talking about that specifically, and for a couple of applications, a few applicants went out of their way to say like, this person will be serving veterans. And so we wanted our PLL to be a veteran, if possible. And so I remember us being like, oh, that's very thoughtful and taking that into account.
I suppose, Eric, if you really wanted to lock that in, you would find projects that were 2 to 3 year projects.
Okay. All right. Okay. So when evaluating impact, support, safeguards, and recruitment, that's just the one word terms that we use to describe those scoring categories. We really look to the elements, the factors and the examples that we had provided to the programs in the RFP or the application instructions. Like we really tried to stick to the written guidance to the applicant so that we weren't, quote, hiding the ball. So that was sort of our yardstick for like, did they talk about enough? Did they talk about the right things? It's like, what guidance did we give them? Of course, they could deviate from it if they wanted, but we use that as our starting place. For special consideration, staff looked for a clear focus, like an explicit focus on COVID-19, natural disaster, or rural legal aid, or for COVID-19, perhaps it'd be more accurate to say like legal issues arising during the pandemic, and they'd be focusing on those people that had those experiences. Evaluated the strength of that connection, if it was a very, if it was a very clear connection, if they talked about it enough that we were able to conclude that it was that the PLO would indeed be focusing on mitigating those issues. And then we tended to confer more points if they focused on some combination of those things. So, the number of points that were given kind of varied on sort of if the connection was rural, for instance, if it was several rural counties. I think like Legal Services Northern California, for instance, hit several rural counties. So they might have only focused on rural, but they got a lot of points because of the number of rural counties. Others, maybe it was one rural county, but also COVID-19. So they may have gotten a lot of points for focusing on both, even though it was fewer rural areas. So there was kind of a holistic staff consensus process for figuring out how many points to give. And that's why I said this was the area where we may have started the most apart and had to kind of come to the middle. But we were able by the end, by the 32nd application, we were able to remember back to all the applications that had come before and said, oh, for that org, we only gave 3 points for that. This is basically the same project. So let's just give them 3 points here. And then we went back to the top and made sure that we were consistent.
Yeah, so we recalibrated several times through the review process because we wanted to be consistent, right? It's hard because we had several sessions. In our first session, we had only reviewed the first half of them, but our scores changed once we read the whole set individually, and then when we came together as a group.
Yeah.
Well, when Chris raises the example of CRLA and them getting special consideration points, that to me is actually very odd. Their program is situated in rural areas. So giving CRLA extra points for working on rural concerns is just, as opposed to LAFLA, for example, it's just sort of an interesting thing.
They have a built-in advantage almost.
Pardon?
It's like they have a built-in advantage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, that's inherently the area that they serve and the issues they address.
Yeah, yeah, that's
so
true. You're totally correct. We did do that. We did not discount like any built-in advantages. Like so, the example that I gave is Legal Services Northern California, but it's very similar to CRLA. That's almost, their service area is almost entirely rural, and we didn't want to penalize any applicant because they were already specializing in providing services to a particularly underserved population. So we treated them like we did everyone, even the urban programs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not criticizing. It's just that there has been for the past few years this real focus on rural, and it's sort of, if you think about it, a few more steps down the road, it's, you know, it raises, for me, it raises questions like this.
But I think it's purposeful because there usually is a lack of funding in rural. So we're trying to smooth that out a little bit.
And the county's legal services.
And then this RFP was really explicit in terms of the special consideration and you know, an interest in rural and COVID related issues. So if you want to call it an advantage because they naturally serve, I don't, you know, I think it's fine because it was explicit in what we wanted in the RFP.
Right.
That's a great observation, though. I think that was
and potentially one of the first opportunities for their business model supporting the funding source or the funding objective. So
It'd be great if this leads to them getting lawyers in Delano.
yes.
So I can actually pull up this map as a PDF so we can zoom in a little bit. You know, it's hard to show this much information on a slide. I also didn't mean to actually like have you for the first time try to go down that chart and like match the colors. So our hope is that, you know, you had a chance to look at the map before the meeting. But if I were to kind of highlight things for you on here, I would highlight the following. What this map is showing you is it's just trying to show you the geographic diversity of the recommended recipients. Each applicant would be getting a grant to hire just one PLL, but that PLL could serve any number of counties that they said to which they would try and make the PLL services available to. So it's important to caveat this with, you know, Legal Services Northern California is one of the recommended programs. They're the light green dot at the top of the map. They pretty much selected their whole service area. In 1 year, that PLL might serve people in every single one of these counties, or maybe it would just be a percentage of those counties, but they're going to try and make the PLL services available to all of these counties. So it's kind of showing you more geographic spread. It's not showing you concentration of PLL's time or something like that, unless the PLL is only serving 1 or 2 counties, and then it does correlate to that. it's
And there-
not showing you, oh, I'm sorry, go on.
Oh,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead. I was just gonna say, and there are a number of program projects that are statewide, and it was unwieldy to put a dot in every county. So just know that those that are that they have the NA next to it, that there are some statewide projects.
Yeah, so that was Child Care Law Center, Legal Access Alameda, and Public Counsel selected every county. Just for example, I think Legal Access Alameda's is the PLL is going to be coordinating natural disaster legal services throughout California, but it's going to end up at the end of the year, it'll be whatever counties needed that help. To extent their services will be statewide, because I think they're going to also be training pro bono attorneys all across the state to get them ready for a natural disaster. And then the actual requests for services will come from whatever counties have natural disasters. But they checked every county, and we didn't plot a dot for them because the map looked way too cluttered to have multiple dots in every single county. So instead, we just put an asterisk next to theirs. So yeah, so this is mostly to show you geographic spread. You know, there's an obvious part of California there and around Central California without any dots. And unfortunately, that was just the support centers and QLSPs serving those counties either didn't apply, or in like CRLA's case, I think, yeah, CRLA is one of ours. In CRLA's case, they just selected the PLL to focus on other counties. CRLA, you know, picked San Joaquin, Stanislaus, San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, and Ventura. And then in other situations, the QLSPs and support centers serving those counties just didn't apply. Okay, so staff recommend, this is getting, I think there's like maybe 2 slides left, and then it's we'll just open it up to more of your questions. But staff recommend 20 awards. It's all of the, and I can pull up the spreadsheet too in a moment, but it's essentially everyone who scored an 81 or above. So the highest score was 100. The map suggests that we think the scores themselves achieve geographic diversity. The executive committee, the commission executive committee, and the board of trustees both liked the idea of staff striving for geographic spread of awards if the scores did not themselves yield that. If it looked, for instance, like almost everyone was going to be in LA and San Francisco, there was the direction to staff to try and take geographic spread into account. We didn't actually need to do that because we thought the scores achieved a really meaningful geographic spread by themselves.
But we did take a very close look once we did the scores to see whether we needed to smooth out certain parts. And, you know, there was some discussion like, should we fund another project in the Inland Empire? But when we went back and we looked at that particular project, and it was just not a strong project. So we felt comfortable with the score as it stands, that we wouldn't have to, you know, move up a project for geographic diversity, since we were able to achieve that with the natural scores themselves.
And a part of that will be because the total score took into account the special consideration points, and one of those was rural. So to a certain extent, some of that natural spread was probably due to the fact that the rural focus PLL proposals got more points to begin with.
But we thought that addition in this PLL grant application was a really good addition, and I think that was, you know, from the lessons learned from some of our other kind of grant funding. To give ourselves some discretion and some flexibility to achieve the geographic diversity.
So I have a question about some of the larger organizations that might be in Los Angeles or San Francisco, but also have, you know, their footprint in the rural areas. So something to what Chris just said in terms of these PLLs may work in the rural, but not necessarily. Is that how the applicants have submitted their application?
Well, it's where the service area is available. But the thing is, I think it's hard for programs to then predict for the upcoming year, you're going to get a client, and each, say, take Lisnick, for example. I can't, it's like, what, 15 counties there? I think it would be hard for Lisnick to predict that PLL will be serving, say, 2 or 3 clients in each of those counties. It's just not kind of how programming works for programs. So I I think being available, and then we'll have data at the back end to see how, you know, how close that is.
And this is just my impression, so take it for what it's worth. Like the just not hard and fast. The what I recollect, and we have a spreadsheet that actually shows for each of the recommended grantees which counties they selected. What I was doing is a scan of it to figure out how many rural counties would be covered, and if that was a meaningful number to provide to you. I noticed that most of these organizations selected either one or more predominantly urban counties or focused almost entirely on rural. An exception would be like Legal Services Northern California, because they included Sacramento in their list. There's one where like, oh, that's actually a pretty urban area, and a lot of rural ones. Most of them, if you look through their list, they're like, oh, they only selected rural areas, or they only selected 1 to 2 urban ones. But that that was my impression. We can actually pull up the list, and we can see if that's correct.
Would it be helpful to go to the scoring sheet?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think I only had, I will do that. I'll just pull it up. Let me just see if I had anything else from these last 2 slides that I wanted to point out. I actually do have. So if it's okay, Dwan, before I pull it up,
Of course.
I wanted to flag that I already told you 3 PLLs would be considered like statewide or all counties. We notice practice area diversity. They could select more than 1 area of law for each PLL. So this doesn't add up to 20, but essentially the most common areas are 11 PLLs would have housing law as a primary focus. At least 8 would have family domestic violence, and public benefits income maintenance would be 7. Most of them would have a COVID-19 natural disaster and or rural legal aid piece to their work. I wanted to give you the update here that total scores determined each organization's place in line for funding, but we didn't otherwise look at their score to decide how much funding to recommend. So it's not the case that those who scored the highest got most of their funding asked, for instance. It was really, we just started with the highest scoring. We worked through the list until the funding pool was depleted. We recommended.
Oh, sorry, Chris, let me just interrupt. And you know, the 80 and above number, though it sounds like that was our cutoff, it was a natural cutoff. Like Chris is saying, we went down the line and we happened to stop at 80 because at that point we looked at individual budgets and then we didn't have any more money. But it wasn't that we said we're only going to fund 80 and above.
Yeah, that's right.
Even though it looks that way because it's like
it does. You're like, oh yeah, they gave them like B minus up, or like a 20 is such a round number, but it's totally a coincidence the funding was gone by that point. And so we recommended giving if the program is recommended for an award, we recommended that they get their full budget ask only if they had put a lot of other non-PLL grant funding into the budget. So they had the opportunity to specify another grant that would help subsidize it, or just to self-fund it in some other way. There was only, if my memory serves me, maybe 3 or 4 of the programs, maybe 5 at most, that did that, where they maybe like they only asked for $40,000 of a PLL grant. The rest was going to come from another funding source. So because they had already discounted their own request, if we were recommending them for funding, we recommended the full budget ask. Almost everyone else got kind of like 80% in the 80% or 90% of their ask, depending on how much they were seeking. What staff did in giving folks most but not all of what they were requesting is staff took to heart the commission, executive committees, and board executive committees' sense that staff should try to balance the desire to maximize the number of funded positions, create as many jobs as possible for PLLs, with making sure the grants were enough money that most programs could accept the award amount, that it wouldn't be unaffordable to them. And so that's why we did that. If we had just gone down the list and give everyone their full ask, we calculated we would have been able to make 17 awards instead of 20. So it would be 3 fewer funded positions, but that was the alternative that we looked at. There was only 2 programs that we gave under 80% of their ask. I think it was in the mid 70s. Both of them happened to be the law school programs, and that was purely because their payroll taxes and benefits percentages were significantly higher than the rest of the groups. So
Yeah,
instead
the
of being like
indirect was
20 to
very
25,
high.
it was like 30 to 40%. So they got a little bit less than everyone else did. The last update I have is Legal Access Alameda is, and I'll pull up the budget spreadsheet, or I'll pull up the spreadsheet in a moment, but you'll see they were our second highest scoring application. They got 98 points. They let staff know after we had prepared the materials that they accidentally put in the wrong salary figure into their budget, because they were supposed to put in the salary figure for their whatever their first year attorneys would get. They did actually put in a number that corresponded to the first step on their attorney's salary scale, but they forgot that their salary scale starts with attorneys who have at least 3 years of experience, that they don't accept attorneys that have only 1 or 2. They would accept a PLL with 0 years of previous experience, but they used math to figure out what they would pay a first-year attorney who would technically be off the scale, and that was a little bit less than what they'd actually put in the budget by about $2,500. Staff recommends, Dwan and I decided to leave our funding recommendation for Legal Access Alameda the same. We recommended $65,000 because that, even if we adjusted for that, they'd still be getting less than their full ask. They were also like the second highest scoring program, and if they don't, they'll have to pick the actual first year salary they would give to an attorney. They're going to have to use that lower figure. Whatever is left over, and this is true for every program, if they have anything left over after the award is done, they have to give it back. It gets distributed by IOLTA formula. So we didn't see the need to adjust our funding recommendation for them downwards when they already weren't getting their full ask anyway. But I wanted to flag that update had come in after we prepared the materials, and it was a difference of the exact amount was
2,000, right, Chris?
Yeah, so the salary figure they put in there was $2,291 too high, and that was over the course of a 12-month
But
as
if
an
you don't
annual
feel
salary.
comfortable with that recommendation, we can adjust them down that amount or
No.
some proportionate.
It would basically put like $2,000 back into the pool that could go to someone else, but there would only be it would just be like $2,000 that could be reallocated basically to a different program. Okay, so that was this. So let me pull up the funding spreadsheet. Just one second. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for a moment.
And we're happy to answer, once Chris pulls that up, any particular applicant to give you more information. If you want to pull out one and we can all look at together, whatever question to make you feel comfortable with the recommendation.
I have a more general question of, were you surprised with the number of applicants of 32? Was that too many, did you think, or not as many as you had anticipated?
I think personally, this whole process, I don't know if we shared with you, when the legislation first passed, Don and I did kind of a back of the napkin kind of calculation, and we anticipated that attorney contribution would be a lot lower. And actually this past year, it took a 10%, 13% dip, and people were still contributing. So at that time, when the legislation passed, we thought maybe we'd be able to fund between 3 and 6 or 3 and 5. So we've been pleasantly surprised that we were able to fund upwards of 20. So I don't know if it's quite surprised that there's 32 applications, but I think I'm personally surprised that we're able to fund such a large cohort. That because we have a sizable amount, Chris and I have kind of talked briefly in terms of like providing some additional support for the cohort, doing some training, some now that we have a sizable number, it seems like we really like this grant program can actually make a statewide difference. So I don't know if 32, I was surprised by that. I've just been really pleasantly surprised that every time we get an update from finance, that it's been a lot more than what Chris and I anticipated.
That's great. And I recall Chris saying something about the 1.36 is the projected amount, or is there, and are you anticipating there to come further funds or?
Well, like I said, we projected conservative. There really isn't reason for us to believe that next year's fee statement will actually be the same 10% or 13% dip that we just encountered because of COVID and the pandemic, but we wanted to err on the conservative side. So I do anticipate it will be higher than that. And at that point, because we're not fully funding these grants, we will redistribute it proportionately. in the event that, we have a lot more money and it would be too late to redistribute and be used, that money is just going to get rolled back to the IALTA programs anyways. So it's not wasted money or money that will go somewhere. It will go out to serve clients in a slightly different way. But that's part of the legislation. So I think it was well crafted.
So I can hide, because it's a lot of it. It's spreadsheet tries to squeeze a lot onto one page. So I can hide like the column with all the areas of law if that's not what we want to focus on. It'll be a little easy to read. But essentially, you only see part of the spreadsheet, but these 20 programs that I just highlighted are the 20 that from highest scoring to lowest scoring that would get funding until the funding was gone. So I can scroll down so you can see the other ones, but there's nothing in the funding column here because we reached our goal of 1,359,000 after Child Care Law Center. So let me know if you want me to scroll down, but otherwise I'll just leave it with these.
And there is also another spreadsheet that breaks down the total score. If there's one in particular that you want to take a closer look as a group, then we can then go to the other spreadsheet. But we're sorry, there's just a lot of meeting materials.
Oh yeah, whichever one is most helpful, I can pull that one up too, if that's
But this one's fine. This raises a question I asked on the first slide, and that is some of these applicants are funded at 100%, and some of them are funded at less than 100%. If you had a surplus and you were to spread it out amongst the 20, would you then overfund?
No, we wouldn't generally. We don't generally in this office give programs more than what they requested. At that point, then we would just spread it out to the save for. And I don't know if you can tell from this spreadsheet.
Yeah, it shows.
It shows. Okay.
For example, you're funding, let's see, Legal Aid Foundation of LA, LAFLA is asked for 50, getting 50.
And because they're kicking in, they have other sources of funding. Right. So we wouldn't give them more money than they need. So in that instance, we would skip over that particular program. So
the formula gets to be a little bit
it's a modified. It's distributed across the board, but not
Sorry about that scroll. I was just putting in the percentages so you could see which ones got 100, which ones were not 100.
What would be helpful for me, I don't know about my colleagues, but if you were to walk through why did Legal Services Northern California end up with a total score of 100, just for us to start kind of getting into your mind as to how you were doing this.
Yeah, Chris, you want to take maybe you can do the first three and then see if the committee would like more. And I have to say, the first three or four, I'm not sure of the first four, but I'll say the first three, we all felt very strongly that they really stood out, that they were the strongest applicants. But Chris, you can walk through
the other spreadsheet as well, because I think that would be helpful.
For that one. I think I would want to show you the scores. Yeah, let me pull that one up. If it decides to load.
On my screen, the icons for each of us was on the right-hand side, and it covered some of the columns. So I pulled it down to the bottom, and it's now horizontal, and that opened up the entire graph.
Oh, great. Okay.
Right, and another way to Rich's point, another way to get if folks are having a hard time seeing it is to go to the view and put everyone on top. Right, so you could view
putting everyone on top helps.
Yeah.
Okay, can you all see the new spreadsheet? Sometimes I don't know with screen share if you're still looking
at
the old one.
It's still thinking, Chris. It's still it hasn't come up.
Let me I'll stop sharing. And then I'll restart it and see if that gets it to work. I can see it.
Can I ask a question on if things go well and there is a surplus that you want to distribute? Will you so let's exclude the ones that got 100% of their ask. For the remaining recipients, would you just figure a equal percentage increase for
it's hard, Kim, if you go down to say the next one that would get funding, like APILO, Asian Pacific Islander Legal Outreach, because we won't know if there's going to be a surplus until about the earliest is March of next year, and then we have to the funds have to be spent by.
Oh no! I'm not saying add 21. Although I get Rich's consistent spreading the wealth, his approach, and I agree with that. But on this one, what I'm saying is, if there's a surplus, will you just have an equal percent? Will you figure out the percentage by which you can increase?
Yeah, that's exactly what we do, with the exception of what Rich just raised. If we were already funding that by 100%, we're not going to give them more than what they can use. And we would do similar to HPV. Recall that we had to reallocate funding. What we would do then is go back to the program and say, this is the additional funding. This is would be your cut. Could you use the money? And in some programs can't. And then we have to go back and then redistribute that amount. So it's a back and forth.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
It's very tricky. We really don't like it when there are these hard spend down provisions in the legislation. It makes it very difficult for programs and for us. It's just inflexible.
And is Legal Access Alameda, is that a new name for?
Yeah, they changed their name. This used to be called Voluntary Legal Services. This is the Alameda program. I can't. Voluntary Legal Services
Corporation.
Yeah.
Volunteer Legal Service.
Yeah.
Corporation.
Okay.
Yeah,
This is TILA's
right.
program.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, so I think the request was to model how staff approached scoring with using LISNIC, the top one, as the example. Is that right?
That's correct. Thank you.
Okay, and hopefully you can see the spreadsheet now that breaks it out by scoring rubric category. So what staff sort of, staff's approach was, if it was just going to get a meets expectations, it was sort of enough information that staff was like, okay, this is probative of achieving the scoring rubric category. So for example, for impact, it was, leverage the provisional license on a project that was within the organization's experience or expertise or something like that. If they give enough detail to evidence that, and there was nothing really missing, it wasn't like particularly compelling or exemplary in any way, and it got a meets, staff didn't necessarily put detailed notes as to why they gave it a meets. We did have a policy of requiring detailed notes if we were going to give them an exceeds or by detailed notes, I mean like a couple of sentences as to exactly why they got an exceeds or a below. So for Legal Services Northern California, they got a meets on impact. And then for support, I have in my notes, they exceeded because the program will offer thoughtful scope of trainings on a weekly basis, which was something that none of the other programs did, like a weekly training program for their PLL.
But Chris, let me just add on the impact one. This one was like a little bit splitting hairs. I really liked this project, and I gave it a 25. And Chris, if I recall correctly, Chris and Elizabeth gave it the 20, and we came to agreement on the 20. And the reason why I conceded is because even with the 20, they're already at the highest. But I think this is one that was teetering between a 20 and 25 because it was such a good project. And that's where it had a lot of discussion, but practically speaking, it was already so high that, at that point, that's why that's where kind of the subjectivity comes in a little bit. Somebody can think it's 20 and another person can think it's 25, but we were more or less in agreement that this was a very strong project across the board. Yeah. And that special consideration, sorry, Chris, when you get there, then I have something to say about special consideration.
Oh yeah, sure. So I was gonna say, we gave them a exceeds on recruitment because they're the only program that recruits nationally, or at least that described in their application response, a national search strategy, including emailing all ABA accredited law schools. And I think they actually do this not just for the PLL, but they do this regularly, including emailing all ABA accredited law schools and they add legal associations like local bar associations that serve historically underrepresented communities as part of their recruitment strategy.
This is PLL only in California?
This is for the Legal Services Northern California recruitment strategy for their PLL.
No, but aren't PLLs only?
The PLLs in California, but they're doing a national search is what Chris is saying. But yeah, obviously the PLL will have to come to California. But there are instances where somebody that may be from California has a law degree or, is out of state, and there's some reason why they're coming back. But we like the fact that it was a national search. It was very thoughtful.
Yeah, the PLL doesn't have to have graduated from a California law school. enter through what's called the expanded pathway, which is anyone since I think it's maybe July of 2015 onwards who scored a 1390 or above on the bar exam but didn't pass. They can become a PLL, and that doesn't require that they've graduated from a California law school or that they live in California now. And then for special consideration, I have the PLL will focus on COVID-19 tenant assistance and disaster relief throughout legal services of Northern California's 23 county service area, which is predominantly rural. So that's kind of how we, that's been like just long enough that I can't quite remember like exactly how they phrased some of their responses for these different categories, but that's how we approached it. Is we needed to have something need to be glaringly missing to go below expectations, or there needed to be something sort of exemplary about it compared to the pool, the rest of the pool, for them to go to exceeds.
Chris, can you do legal access Alameda? Because this one was really a special project that stood out.
Yeah, hold on. I'm looking through my notes, so let me just scroll up to them.
Just before you go there, I think this is what Rich was speaking to and Kim underscored. Just really quickly, how, looking at number 9, I believe it's WorkSafe Inc. They're scored 90. They're receiving 85,000. What did they request? You had a column that showed the percentage that they were, that each.
If it's
That
okay,
was the other spreadsheet.
If it's okay, I'm gonna switch back to the other spreadsheet really fast. Okay. And I just tacked on this column for you here. Hopefully you can see it now. It's all the way on the right. It
no,
doesn't
that's
look
helpful.
great because I just.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Yeah.
Super
So
helpful.
WorkSafe is row 14. It's 81%. It was what the staff recommended giving them because they asked for 105 and then the recommendations for 85.
Yeah, and their 105 was a bigger ask than anyone else.
Yeah, and you have to be, just keep in mind their support center, and generally speaking, I don't know, I could say this across the board, but generally speaking though, with support centers, they hire in more experienced attorneys. Their pay scales tends to be a bit higher.
For a first year attorney, yeah, we thought that was high compared to the group.
So the real question is, when you get, some surplus, how is this going to be distributed? Would they get more than anyone else because they are the least funded in terms of percentages? But I think that Dawn, you answered that really. You're going to ask these people if they really need any more money.
Yeah, I mean, and then it's really gonna, when Chris and I briefly talked, if it's a small surplus, that what we would do is kind of a proportional distribution and exclude the ones that have we're funding at 100%. In the event that it's a large surplus, I think at that point we would have to revisit it and bring to you a motion that maybe is a little bit more nuanced.
But it wouldn't, I'm sorry, Rich, it wouldn't go down to Asian Pacific Islander legal outreach, number 21, that just missed the mark by 1 point.
I don't believe so, Bonachet, because of the timing issue. Like we mentioned, we won't know if there's a surplus until at earliest February, late February of next year. And so then that would only be 4 months for us to notify them. We don't know if they would have a PL at that time for them to hire. I think
they would
really
have to
difficult.
spend it down. Yeah, they would have only between, so we would know by like mid to late February what the amount was. It would take a little while to get the grant out the door, and they'd have to sign a grant agreement, but then they'd have to spend it down by June 1st. So they certainly couldn't spend down like a year's worth of funding. Like maybe you could, there's an approach where we could give them, if they only had 4 months to spend it down, we could give them 4 months worth of funding. I guess the alternative is we'd have to they'd sign a grant agreement that was like retroactive if they had already hired a PLL, and then, but I don't know, they would.
It would be very difficult logistically for us, honestly, and that would probably not be the preferred unless there is a lot of surplus. So I'm not ruling it out completely, but
I think it really comes down to the fact that the statute says that on June, well, it doesn't say on June 1st, it says when the provisional licensure program ends. which is June 1st.
You
That the money has to get reallocated.
you said that the typical grant is 12 to 14 months, if I recall your first slide, something like that.
Yeah, 12 to 13.
What does that mean as a practical matter? Will these people have basically spent their grant by next March, or is it just different for every organization?
They get to request the grant period. This is unique in that we're giving them total flexibility. We want to give them the maximum amount that the legislation is in effect, so they can go back retroactively to January 1st and then propose something from January 1st until the legislation ends, which is June of next year. But they haven't all done that. Some grantees have proposed a shorter period of time, and that's why you have this like a range. But we haven't said your grant has to be X amount of time. We've let them propose that.
Well, I
Joanne, did
think
you want me to do legal access as an example, or?
Is that helpful? It's just
Well, I'd be curious to go on the other end, take an organization that was below expectations.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my
okay,
next
sure.
question.
Ooh,
Do you want to?
oh, let's just pick one. Should we, I feel bad picking legal services for seniors, but should we just any of these, I guess? Okay, so let me just so you know what I'm doing is I'm looking at a different spreadsheet that has my notes.
Maybe Chris, we don't need to pick one in particular.
So we don't feel like we're calling anyone out.
Right, and
Yeah.
and maybe more so you guys can kind of give us a general.
Yeah.
Great. Let me review this will take me only like 10 seconds. Just let me skim the notes for one of these programs, and that will jog my memory as to like kind of what ended up being a below expectations. I just won't tell you which program.
Yeah.
So from my recollection, and until Chris gets his notes, for I recall from my own notes, is that they were really slim on the details of how what the PLL would be doing. Some were just a couple of sentences, and it was very slim on. I had a hard time visualizing exactly what the services PLL would be providing, or in other instances, it seems like no support. And that was a big red flag for us that, with this PLL program, because they're an entry level attorney position, that they needed to be provided with a lot of support. And when it was really slim or no support, that was hard for us to recommend funding or high scoring in some of those other categories.
So I can illustrate it for you. I won't tell you which program this is, but it's one that is not recommended for funding. And just to give you an example, I think this is somewhat representative of some of the ones that were lower scoring. So for kind of a low score on impact, as an example, the applicant just said that the PLL will assist with the organizations. This happened a lot. Will just assist with the organization services. And they kind of copy and pasted like what their services were from their website. But they didn't go on to say what the PLL, so they just said, this is our scope of work, the PLL will help. They didn't go on to say what the PLL specifically would be doing, what his, her, or their role would be in those services. Would they be litigating? Would they just be, running the intake line? They weren't specific about that. For a low score in support, so that would have been for impact. For a low score in support, some folks just kind of listed a small number of possible trainings that they would give. We'll train them on A, B, and C topics, and then they'll go through our normal onboarding, and then they didn't go at all beyond that. When the RFP and the application question asked them to talk about things like what technology they would provide, would they have access to legal research databases or templates, would they get a mentor? So if they just said, well, we train them on ABC and that's it, that tended to be a below. For recruitment, and this is one I kind of suggested earlier was pretty common for a below. If they just failed to describe what the criteria for the position were, that was something that the application asked them to do. What their evaluation process is, how they select the person, what they're looking for, and how if they didn't describe at all how they perform their outreach, that tended to get a below. So there were a couple of programs that just said, we've already hired our PLL, they've been working with us for some time. And that was like their 1 to 2 sentence response to that question. And that was a common like below for recruitment when the application instructions were very specific as to what they needed to talk about, because they're allowed to have the PLL be someone who already works there, but they needed to at least say like, how did they pick that person back when they hired them, and what makes them a great fit for the organization and for this like scope of work. That I won't tell you. Those are pretty common below expectation notes.
Not a lot of depth.
Mhm.
Yeah.
There were some programs that definitely just wrote like 2 or 3 sentences for some of the responses. And then
Well,
when you put it up against some programs that wrote like several paragraphs, it was.
Well, it also made us think like, if there wasn't a lot of effort in putting together the grant application, is there going to be effort in providing the support and creating a really positive experience for the PL that will then go into your point, which have them want to pursue a career in public interest and return to that organization or a similar organization and work. We want a positive experience for the PLL so that we don't have these retention issues. And so if it wasn't thoughtful, it was really hard for us to score high.
We've discussed this before, where the larger organizations have more staffing and more experience in writing these grant applications, where the smaller ones tend to not have as much. I don't know if you noticed the division in that way, based on who received who were in the top 20. I'm looking at them now, actually.
So we really try to concentrate on substance versus a well-packaged but that's a fine line, right? Because sometimes well-packaged makes you visualize the substance easier, right?
Right.
But we really try to not nitpick on like, it was beautifully drafted, but really like, the core.
I did notice there were a few programs where we thought they just weren't as experienced at grant writing, and we did kind of feel like, oh, we wish they had a little bit more experience, because like we think maybe this could be a great hire, but since it's a competitive process and we gave them so much guidance in the RFP and in the application instructions, and even the application form itself, like gave them suggested topics to talk about. For some of them, if they just didn't do it, we're like, we can't overlook that for them just because they're smaller or less experienced. When we're holding other programs to a higher standard, we had to have the same standard, and so they got scored low. But I think we felt like we wished that they knew what to do.
We've run into this before. This is like a common theme, and I know it came up with the last HP grants where it's hard to overlook the manner in which the proposal is presented, but it's kind of like a common theme that runs through, and it's a struggle. I just wanted to say, for some of the smaller programs who have less resources, there are resources outside of them. I think Shriver was doing training for all of its young lawyers. So even though it's a small program, I think there are resources that if the programs did a little digging, they could find out that outside of their program, their provisional attorneys could get training. I know the biggest complaint of all of law students is always just the lack of support from a lawyer to help them and that they can go to. So that's why I think the feedback from these provisional attorneys is going to be really important. And even if the first year initially we can't require that they complete something, we could at least, ask them voluntarily, could you, evaluate your experience?
Yeah. And it was really important to staff that we really took the responses to support and safeguards. Safeguards is almost more about protecting the client. Like you can be meeting with this person weekly, doing case review, that kind of thing. But like support is kind of about like, will this PLL feel like they're getting what they need as a brand new attorney to do work carefully and meaningfully? And we really took all their responses quite seriously and really like looked to see like, is this person going to have a successful experience at this organization? And so there may be a slight correlation. It's possible that some of the programs that weren't as strong at grant writing would actually give the PLL a terrific experience, really a lot of training and a lot of supervision. But if they didn't take the time to describe it in their application, we did wonder, like, are they also ready to kind of protect this PLL and make sure they have a good time and the clients are well served? And we had to base it, obviously, the score on what they actually wrote, but there could be a correlation between like grant writing and org size and their ability to provide that level of supervision support certainly the bigger organizations were able to describe in great detail the amazing training programs all
But
their
that's
new
not
staff
across the
members
board,
go
though.
through.
But
you
that's
know?
not across the board. If you'll notice, and I won't point out the organizations, but there are some in the bottom that are big organization that didn't score high. So,
That's true. Yeah, that is true.
It's a little bit like the Malcolm Gladwell European footballer syndrome, if you've read any of his books, where he describes the fact that young footballers in Europe who are born at the beginning of the year have a continuous advantage over other footballers born later on in the year because they grow, they are bigger, taller, stronger when the recruiting season begins only by the happenstance of their date of birth. It's going to happen here that the bigger, stronger programs are going to be better applicants. They're going to write grants more appealing to grant makers. And in the end, they will be doing a better job training. It's up to those that are 21 and below to poach later on.
Yeah.
Hey, Dwan, what number 6 or Chris, Senior Citizens Legal Services? Can you remind me who is that organization?
That used to be, I remember Creighton, that we had
that's what I was wondering.
yeah, but
Yeah.
it's he's at a different organization now. It's a new ED.
Okay.
So that's Creighton's old organization.
Yeah.
Well, bravo.
Yeah, that's great.
I was hoping that's, I
Yeah,
get
they put together really a focused
very good.
application.
Yeah. That's
great.
very good.
That's
I
a
can pull up
very impressive comeback.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah, it's
really great.
heartwarming.
Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah.
I wish he could have enjoyed it.
Yeah, of the senior programs, that one, obviously you see it's high scoring, it stood out. They were able to tie it to COVID. The other senior programs could have done that, but they did a good job articulating that in the application.
Yeah.
So that one, we loved that application because they just did a really great job of writing to the brief, so to speak. Their special consideration was very focused on rural South County, Santa Cruz, and both COVID-19 and natural disaster relief. And they got very detailed, talking about the need to advocate for rebuilding permits for fire victims. And they've actually had like natural disasters in the last year, and they're expecting more. How 38% of their cases involved COVID-19 related, just 38% of their organization's cases across the board involve COVID-19 related issues, and the like. So they got really detailed. They wrote a very good application.
That's really great.
And I think that amount of funding is going to make a difference for that organization. Kim, I think you were in the ERC for them, and they were talking about fundraising. So we do think like, and this is where we could have gone either 20 or 25, but I think what pushed them over to 25 is you can really visualize the impact that how much is it? 82,000 can make in this community for that particular program.
Right.
It's really fabulous because there was a lot of concern with those conferences.
They asked for 87, so it's pretty close to what they asked for.
In our RFP, we did not, in fact, we excluded immigration. Although I did notice that several of the groups indicated that the areas of law included immigration. But none of this funding was intended for the PLLs to work in the immigration area. It was supposed to be natural disaster, COVID-19, and other areas, but not immigration, right?
Well, they would get special points in those areas, Rich, but not necessarily that they couldn't practice in other areas.
There was no statutory requirement that it go to any particular area of law. So it ended up being up to the commission and the board of trustees if they wanted to funnel it towards particular practice areas. And yeah, like Dawn said, we created those special consideration categories to get like bonus points. Like those were like the most compelling applications would touch on one or more of those three things: COVID-19, rural, or natural disaster. But they were welcome to pitch any of their IOLTA qualifying, any of their QLSP or support center work was like on the table.
But just looking at the spread of the 20, it looks like you guys really did a fine job of making sure we're hitting childcare and mental health and veterans and seniors and inner city. And there's just a really great mix of grant making being done here.
Yeah, if it's helpful, I can pull up the Let me switch my screen share really quickly to just the chart where I think this ended up being the last page of the meeting packet. You can see they were, no, again, they were allowed to select more than one area of law for the PLL, and a lot of them selected like maybe 2 or 3 for their PLL. We didn't make them pick one. So there's more than 20 items in the second column, but you can see for each area of law that we normally ask them to check a box for on the application, how many of the programs are doing it. So there's a couple like education, there's just one of the recommended grantees is doing it. But of all of those areas of law that are on the state bar applications, we try and keep the list the same. The only one that no one checked from the recommended pool of 20 PLL hires was the only area of law was juvenile. And I don't actually remember anyone submitting an application to work on like juvenile legal issues specifically. But every other area was served by at least one of the recommended programs.
When you're going through this process, maybe this is for Dwan, but Chris, are you thinking about how this will play to the legislature?
Yeah, I mean, I think of the design, I think that's why the geographic diversity, we didn't have a built-in in terms of like, we wanted substantive diversity in substantive areas, but we like that it happened, that there was a lot of spread, but I think these are all, and like Bonachet saying, the quantitative, I think we didn't, we thought about generally, so that impact category, but I think moving forward, we should take your recommendation, Bonachet, and something a little bit more explicit, because the legislature responds to numbers and saying X amount of individuals were served or cases closed, though we understand that's not just the quantitative data, but I think the legislature would respond to this, seeing that there's like a spread in geographic diversity, a spread in substantive area. You see like the variety of constituency. There's another spreadsheet that Chris has that shows the constituencies that are served, and it's really a diversity, not just seniors, veterans, rural. I think they respond to that.
Yeah, and it's really because they need that to go up, you know, to advocate for more funding as well, right? So the more we can give them, the better, and they're equipped then to be able to support really these initiatives.
And over the years, we've gotten better at designing the grant applications. For example, when they apply, they have to check which counties they serve. And so the legislature will occasionally ask us, you know, in this particular county with this grant funding, how many PLLs or how many, you know, and we can easily pull that instead of doing a manual. We didn't do that before. And so we've been smarter in the design of the application so that we can easily pull that data for the legislature. And we get a lot of data requests, not just from the legislature, but just various stakeholders that are interested in you know, our work. So thinking about it strategically is helpful in terms of pooling the data.
Yeah,
So-
it strikes me that the most important area for the legislature at this particular point in time is the diversity of the PLLs.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, the PLL's own demographic diversity or the geographic diversity of the
Ethnic.
That that is a good point. I wonder if they're you know, because we collect so much demographic data. The state bar is starting to the last few years, as you see when you fill out your you know, there was an attorney census data. Perhaps Chris, when we do the PLL satisfaction, we can do an optional demographics so that we have that at our fingertips. But that's a really good point, Rich. I don't think we contemplated.
I thought that was part of it. I thought that's what the diversity portion also incled.
No, the diversity was geographic diversity, not so much of the PLL.
No, we encouraged including some language.
That's for the recruitment of a diverse candidate pool, but we don't have.
Yes.
Oh, right. The and that was the Office of General Counsel just advised us to encourage diversity in the applicant pool, but not in the selection of the PLL.
We can't have a quota because of Prop 209. So we can't have a quota, but that doesn't mean that on the back end, when we go to survey, that we know that we report out on the diversity or lack of diversity.
Yeah, I thought it was part of it. So I'm glad that Rich is highlighting it. That would be, I think it would be critical coming out of the Office of Access and Inclusion.
That's great. I put that in our
Yeah.
for our notes for when we collect information from the PLLs. Yeah.
So
So
friends, we're 14 minutes to the completion of this call. Is there anything you want, and I don't want to cut you off, Kim, so I will go back to you, but it just kind of, how do you want to manage the next few minutes?
Well, we have our motions unless there are other questions that
Kim has
can
something.
answer.
well, I just first I want to say, Chris, with Dwan's support, I mean, you've done just a really beautiful job. And by that, I mean, just really clearly articulated, fabulous organization. And for any questions that would come up about why did this program get it? Why did we not get it? I mean, you can state the reasons. I mean, you know each of the applications so well. So, I mean, this is terrific. I had just a suggestion on attachment F for like the overview, the last thing you showed, since the legislators want to know what did I get for my area. I mean, I think, you know, you've got the programs, you've got the substantive areas, you've got the programs. I think it would be really helpful to have another column which just had the geographic information.
Oh, we have that in the spreadsheet. We didn't separate it out.
But I mean, this is like a really clear picture.
Yeah, this is a lot.
Yeah, that's what I'm suggesting. You know,
Yeah.
kind of the keep it simple.
Yeah, so just like you basically just these first three or these
Yeah,
like or
but usually,
counties.
Kim, they're really specific in their ask. Usually they come to us and then we actually repackage a lot of things to suit their specific questions.
Okay, all right, fine. Not
Yeah,
talking about dumbing it down for the.
You know, the other thing that they ask that we're incapable of doing, because, you know, as you know, with the legislatures, you know, their constituency, they can go down to like the zip code, but the way we collect it, the programs report on by county, it doesn't break it up by zip code. That's been a hardship for us to get that level of detail to the legislature.
They're asking about zip by zip code?
Because, you know, certain legislature, they serve like a certain swath, right? And it's like the way that my understanding is the way that it's by zip code. And so we can't get them that level of precision.
Okay.
We're trying to with the HP grants. The HP grants, you'll see, is we actually do ask by zip code. This will be the first cycle, but with any of our other grants, it's been really hard for programs to do. So that will be a test case of how successful we're able to collect that data by zip code.
Okay.
Aren't all the intake applications requiring a zip code?
Not necessarily. You'd be surprised, Rich. So with like the larger organizations that have a sophisticated CMS system, zip code is very easy. But, you know, some of these smaller programs, you'll be shocked that they are still collecting information on an Excel and not a database.
Anyway, Chris, fantastic job.
Yeah, I want to echo that. I think we're all in agreement. Well done, Chris and Dwan and the rest of the staff. So, okay, shall we?
Yeah, thank you very much for that. We appreciate that a lot. So we have OG, the Office of General Counsel suggested that we split this resolution into two resolutions, and they don't fit on one slide. So you know, we obviously wordsmithing is okay, but they both kind of, I'm just going to show you, they're both a little long, and I'll kind of explain why there's so many pieces to them. Dwan, would you remind me, will the executive committee just vote once on, because it's a resolved and a further resolved, or is it two votes?
We should do a two vote just to make it very clean. And
it makes it a little easier.
This language has been vetted by Brady. So unless there are real substantive issues, I would encourage you to stick with the language because Brady's not on the call. But obviously, if you have issues with the substance, then please.
So I'll read it out loud just for the folks who like to hear it as well as read it. So resolved, the Legal Services Trust Fund Commission Executive Committee, acting on behalf of the Legal Services Trust Fund Commission under its delegated authority, and that's language that we're now including in State Bar resolutions, has consulted with State Bar staff and agrees that State Bar staff should implement its staff's recommendations for 2021-2022 PLL grants, recipients and amounts as provided in staff's memo dated May 12th, 2021. Since applicants had to estimate the PLL's start and or end dates, State Bar staff may adjust the grant timelines as necessary to reflect the actual start and end dates of employment. Because the need for that is someone may have estimated their PLL will start on July 1st of 2021, but if they actually start on June 15th and they start paying the person, they'll need the grant to actually be able to go to that person's salary on their first day. And then they might end 2 weeks earlier once the grant runs out. So this just allows us to actually update the person's the grant to reflect that when they actually worked there. And so we'll stop there.
Yeah, so let's, are there any discussions on this before I ask for a motion to approve?
Well, just to get the full context of this, and why doesn't this take care of everything? What else do we need?
We're actually asking for more discretion because we, a lot of these programs, we're giving them a little bit less than what they asked for. So we have to confirm that that amount is acceptable to them. So they're, on the occasion that they don't accept, we have to go to the next. So it gives us a little bit more flexibility. If you're not comfortable with that, then we will just need to call more XCOM meetings, which we're happy to do. But we just thought in the interest of time for the programs and for you and for our sake, that would be easier if we were granted a little bit more discretion. If you don't feel comfortable with that, we are prepared to not pass it.
That's the second one that we're looking at right now.
Should we look at the second one and then go back and vote? So then,
yeah, and I'll read it out loud too, just for the folks like to hear it. So further resolved, and these can be split, right? You can pass the first but not the second. Further resolved, the Legal Services Trust Fund Commission Executive Committee directs State Bar staff, without the need for further consultation with the committee, to award a PLL grant to the next highest scoring program that did not receive funding in the event that an existing PLL grantee declines or returns its award. The alternate program must still meet the requirements for a PLL grant. If there is a tie between the next high scoring programs, State Bar staff may resolve the tie according to the PLL grant's funding priorities, including but not limited to geographic diversity, having already hired a PLL, selected a PLL, and providing COVID-19, natural disaster, and/or rural legal aid. State Bar staff may determine funding amounts for any grants awarded to such alternate grantees in a manner consistent with the funding levels methodology provided in staff's memo.
So this one, should it go to 21? My recollection is there's actually 4 that were voted in at 80. Is that right? So
yeah,
then
and
you would use this metrics to be able to determine of those 4 who received.
You have a great memory, Bonachet, and in that instance,
Yeah,
we actually have thought about that scenario. Chris, you want to walk through how it plays out?
Yeah, exactly. That was why we have this in here. So we're like, okay, so if someone returns its award, if we only pass the first one, that would be like, let's depending on how much they were going to get, let's say $65,000, that just gets put back in the pot. No one gets it. It gets distributed by IOLTA formula a little over a year from now. This resolution would let us go to the next applicant on the list. And as you just noticed, the next highest scoring application is 80, and there's like 4 or 5 programs that scored 80 out of 100 points. So we'd have to pick one. So what this is saying is staff can use the existing funding priorities, which is this list, to break a tie. So we actually talked about, because we thought we were going to have to go into the 80s before we realized the funding was gone. And so of those programs that scored 80, one of them, I'm just gonna say that I think it was Social Justice Collaborative, for instance, was going to be serving counties that no one else was serving. So that would count in its favor for geographic spread. But we would go look at all of those that got 80 points and see, did they already select a PLL? Are they focused on COVID-19, natural disaster, or rural? What's the geographic spread? And try and break the tie that way.
Okay, well, these 2 resolutions seem reasonable. Should we, if there aren't any questions on them, shall we start?
And I just wanted to add, because Chris has begun starting to reach out to programs, just to say that this is a staff recommendation and getting a sense of, there was one scenario where the applicant said that the amount funded was, they would need more money. So we had a call with them to see whether, if we shorten the award period, would that be doable for them? So they're going to see if that's workable. So this resolution gives us kind of those like tweaking powers. Say, I can't remember, Chris, were they like at a 12-month, and maybe if they went down to a 10-month period, it would work. Mm-hmm. So this would be for those type of like tweaks.
So.
Yeah,
you
so
want to-
should we go to the first
separately?
resolution?
So this is basically a vote on like staff's recommendations in the memo with the addition that staff can adjust the grant timeline to reflect start and end dates.
I'm sorry, Eric, I cut you off. Were you
I was
about
going
to
to say, I
move?
mean, can we move, do you want to take two separate votes or do you want to, can we move that we adopt both?
Votes, right?
I would suggest 2 separate votes to make it clean.
Let's just go ahead and go with 2 separate votes. So Eric, do you want to move?
Yeah, I'll move on the first one, move to approve this resolution that we're looking at here.
Okay, Rich is seconding it.
Great, I'll do roll call. Bonneche,
Yes.
Eric,
Yes.
Kim,
Yes.
Rich.
Yes.
Great, motion passes.
Okay.
Great.
And Kim, since you were in agreement with, let's move forward with both of them. Do you want to move on the second one?
Yes.
Okay. Who would like to second?
Yes.
Okay, Rich is seconding.
Okay, great. Bonneche,
Yes.
Eric,
Yes.
Kim,
Yes.
Rich.
Yes.
Great, motion passes.
All right, we have 3 minutes. Okay,
Wow.
who's got a question?
Amazing. Thank you for like digging into the materials and asking such great questions and for providing really helpful guidance on how we collect data from the PLLs after they've started their work.
It's our pleasure. It's our pleasure to collaborate with you guys.
No,
Miss
thank you
Kim.
so much. It was a really great discussion. You gave us lots of ideas, especially on the evaluations.
It was a thoroughly professional job.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. Oh, okay, Kim's got she's gonna get the last word here in the last 2 minutes.
I don't have a last word.
Oh, you had your hand up. I thought you wanted to say, okay. Well, I think amazing. So how we're gonna be bringing this into the larger commission meeting?
As a report,
As a
not
report.
for approval, but
Right, I
June will
understand.
report.
But
And we'll
we'll be
share the
discussing-
spreadsheet. We'll share the spreadsheet sheet, and then if you would like, we can give you an update at the next XCOM meeting on like who's accepted and who hasn't. If not, we can bypass the XCOM and just share it with the larger commission.
No, I
But
think
whatever you prefer.
I think continue to keep us abreast of it. I think
Okay, so we'll build it in
important.
for
Yeah.
XCOM. Okay.
All right. Does that do it?
Yeah.
That's it. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Have a
Bye.
wonderful afternoon.
Bye-bye, everyone.